There is some good news and some bad news. The bad news is I am a lawyer from Victoria. The good news is Rosalind said this is not a PowerPoint town, so it's what we call harm reduction, northern style, I think. You're still stuck with a lawyer, but it's not quite as bad as it could have been. No, but I'm here to talk about the legal sort of landscape around this Land Act amendment process that was begun a few months ago and was discovered by some lawyers actually in Vancouver on the Engage BC website. Didn't look like the government really wanted to talk to the public about it because there was no news release about their plans. And so I'd like to talk about what that means at a high level from a legal perspective, as well as DRIPA and UNDRIP that are kind of behind it. So as a lawyer who's worked for 15 years in this space, I can't see how it will create certainty. To me, it actually looks like it will do the opposite, because what you now will have is an entirely new area of law where you're taking First Nations and having them make decisions on public projects, public decisions, based upon their own legal standards, their own traditions, and their own interests. So this creates a new opportunity for First Nations to be suing each other if they don't like the outcomes of those decisions. It creates new opportunity for proponents to be suing the government and the First Nations for these new legal arrangements. And because this is an entirely new area of law, those challenges, legal challenges, could take 5 years, 10 years, or longer, because they all have to go, potentially, to the Supreme Court of Canada before they can be resolved. So, does it create legal certainty? I can't see how it could. Not in the short to medium term, at least. The next thing you'll hear government say, it's not a veto. It's not a veto. It's just consent. We're just working towards consent. We're trying to get consent. We're working together. You'll hear all kinds of language around this not being a veto. Well, of course it's a veto. It is a veto. In fact, the Land Act decision, the Land Act amendment process was not the first time that government has already enacted agreements like this, consent-based agreements under DRIPA, this law. In fact, the Tahltan central government just passed an agreement, a consent-based agreement, in November of last year on the Red Chris mine. Any of you heard of the Red Chris mine? Probably. It's a gold and copper mine. It's got its environmental assessment, it's got all of its permits, but in order for it to expand its footprint, like most mines, it would need an amendment to its environmental assessment certificate. Normally, you'd have to go through one environmental process to get that amendment through the provincial government's process. Well, now under this new agreement, Red Chris Mines and one for the Tahltan. And according to the news release on the government's website, yes, the Tahltan's consent is required for them to get their amendment certificate. So in one agreement, the government has now doubled the layer of bureaucracy for this one mine, and they've doubled the odds of that permit being denied, because instead of one regulator, you've got two. And so now I want you to think about how it would be possible, or what will happen, if the goal here is to scale this process across the entire province, across every sector of the economy, across every sector of our culture and society, understanding that there are 200 or over 200 separate Indigenous groups in British Columbia, virtually all of whom have overlapping claims and distinct interests from each other. The people who should know, the academics. What are you going to do with the conflicts between these legal systems? You've got over 200 bands in BC. They each are now going to have their own laws and traditions from hundreds of years ago, pre-modern, pre-contact laws and traditions, recognized and respected on an equal playing field as provincial law. What do you do with the overlaps and the conflicts? And you get jargon. You get hand-waving. You don't get answers because they don't know. So I think of this, like I imagine that somebody needs to get to work. They got to get inside the office to do their work. And one day corporate says, you know what, you can't just use your key to get inside anymore. We've got a new keypad on the doors. Don't worry about it, it's really easy. You just got to punch in a few numbers and you'll get in. So you do that for a while. Every now and again, for some reason, they change the code and you have to kind of figure it out. It takes a long time. Sometimes you're on the phone for hours. You miss a morning, you miss an afternoon. Then you hear a couple weeks later, we've actually hired a second security company. We're not very happy with the first one. We've got a second security company, but we're going to keep them both. So now you actually have two codes that you've got to punch in the doorknob. So you punch in the first one, code's changed, and I'll try again. You get through the first, and finally you get through the second one. And a couple weeks later, actually we've hired 6 more security companies. It's just 8 codes for now. I'm sure you can get in there. At some point, the worker is going to say, I'm tired of dealing with all these doorknobs. I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to leave. And that's my concern, is that British Columbians are going to say, I'm tired of dealing with these doorknobs. So I want to raise a couple other just more really concrete examples of legal concerns I do have about this legislation. So typically you have decisions made on public lands and resources that are made by public servants, right, who swear oaths to serve the public, who are bound by all kinds of procedural obligations. They have transparency disclosures. You can go and look up how much your government workers make, their salaries. There's all kinds of procedures we've passed and require people to follow rules for everybody, so that we can protect the democracy and the rule of law that we all benefit from. Well, what happens now is you have, the idea is under the Land Act and other legislation, you'll have public decisions being made by officials appointed by First Nations. And they're being appointed specifically because they have a private interest in that decision. So how does that work? Now you have public decisions being made on the basis of a private interest of at least one, if not more, of the decision makers. To me, that seems fundamentally undemocratic. You wouldn't have Greenpeace volunteers making decisions on pipeline permits, any more than you would have Exxon vice presidents making decisions on pipeline permits, because they have a private interest, right? They should be consulted. They have valuable input to contribute, as should First Nations, 100%. But this is too much of a good thing, isn't it? And so I do have concerns that this is fundamentally undemocratic, despite its best intentions. Finally, I want to talk about, is this good for reconciliation? Maybe it's good for reconciliation. Maybe we have to do it for reconciliation. I can't imagine how this is good for reconciliation, because going back to the action plan, so remember DRIPA has 3 points. We're going to align all BC laws with UNDRIP. We're going to do these joint and consent-based decision-making models over all the laws in BC, potentially. And thirdly, we're going to have these action plans that set out how we're going to do it. Well, I've read the action plan that was passed in 2022. And one of the guiding principles of this action plan is a distinctions-based approach. Well, what does that mean? A distinction-based approach means we're going to treat every single Indigenous group differently than each other. So there's no equality for the First Nations groups either. They're all supposed to be treated differently. And all of those Indigenous groups are going to be treated differently, of course, than all of the non-Indigenous people of the province. So what you have is the antithesis of equality, the antithesis of rules for everybody, as the guiding principle for DRIPA and the amendment of every law potentially in the province. So I don't see how that's good for reconciliation. I don't see how that's good for First Nations. This is a process that is designed to fail, to pit them against each other. They have naturally different interests, right? As any municipality would if you had them sitting around a table of 24 of their neighboring communities. Are they going to agree on any project? No, of course not. So they're doomed to fail, the First Nations are, and the public is doomed to fail too, because if they can't reach a decision, as likely they won't be able to, then the public suffers. Everybody suffers, including the First Nations people that deserve better laws, not just older laws, right? Better government, not just bigger government. So I'll close with this. I'm not sure if any of you have ever experienced this, but I used to suffer from dream paralysis. Have you ever had this where you're sleeping and you're actually lucid, you're awake, but you can't wake yourself up? And you try to scream or say something, but nothing comes out. Or you try to move and you can't move. So I would get this, and it was terrifying. But eventually, my wife and I figured out a system, because I could still breathe. And so I would breathe really fast through my nose. And she would know that was like my smoke signal. She would know, Tim's in trouble. She'd shake me, and she'd wake me up. And I wonder if some of you don't feel like you're trapped in a bad dream right now. And we are here to help wake you up. We are here to free your voice and to mobilize you. Thank you.